He wore the white robes of a holy man, the kind that catches the light in a cathedral and blinds the congregation to the man beneath them. They saw the vestments, the gold thread, the solemn eyes turned heavenward, and believed they were in the presence of purity. He spoke of God with the ease of someone born into faith, his words spilling over the pews like wine from a chalice, intoxicating the devout. The faithful bent their heads, murmured their amens, and never wondered where their shepherd went when the incense smoke faded. They did not imagine the cathedral door closing behind him, the robes loosening, the candles in his private chambers lit for a different kind of ritual. In those rooms no choir sang. The only music was the rustle of fabric falling to the floor, the breath of a woman who was not supposed to exist in his life. She was no nameless indulgence. She had a place in his world, as constant as prayer, as familiar as the Bible on his desk. They did not meet in secret corners of the city. She lived in the shadow of the papal residence itself, under the gaze of the very God he preached about. Their union brought forth a child, not a metaphorical flock, but flesh and blood, a living contradiction swaddled in silk. In the eyes of the Church, this child should not have existed. But he did, and he grew up alongside another, a sibling by circumstance and blood. It was here that the line between family and desire began to blur. Not just in rumour, not just in whispered scandal, but in acts that could not be undone. The papal chambers, the supposed heart of moral authority, became a place where sin was not only committed, but nurtured. This is not the story of a man who stumbled once and repented. It is the story of a life lived in contradiction, of faith wielded like a shield to hide what he did when no one was supposed to be looking. And if you've ever believed the papal crown to be a symbol of untouchable virtue, you may find this tale shatters it completely. To understand the scandal, you have to understand the throne he sat on. The papacy was no mere religious post. In Renaissance Italy, it was an empire unto itself, cloaked not in steel, but in scripture. The Pope was not just the spiritual leader of Christendom, he was a king without borders, a ruler whose influence stretched from the marble corridors of the Vatican to the courts of Europe. Kings sought his blessing, armies feared his excommunication, and peasants knelt at the mention of his name. This was the world Rodrigo Borgia inherited when he became Pope Alexander VI in 1492. His election was not a quiet affair of solemn prayer. It was politics at its most brazen. Deals struck behind closed doors, promises made for votes, favors exchanged like coin. In truth, it was less a divine calling and more a coronation arranged by men who wanted a pope they could trust to protect their interests. And Rodrigo Borgia was exactly that kind of man. The Vatican he stepped into was already a place of wealth and excess. Marble halls gleamed under candlelight, frescoes adorned the ceilings, and gold dripped from every altar. Yet even by the standards of Renaissance decadence, Alexander VI stood out. He was charismatic, shrewd, and utterly unashamed of wielding power for personal gain. From the moment he donned the papal tiara, he ruled with a blend of cunning diplomacy and calculated intimidation. He placed family above all else, not in the sense of protecting Christ's flock, but in the literal sense. Nephews were made cardinals, cousins were given lands, and most notably, his mistress and children were brought into the very heart of papal life. To the public, he maintained the image of the Holy Father, guiding his flock towards salvation. But behind the Vatican's heavy doors, the Borgia court was a theatre of intrigue, ambition, and whispered scandal. Those who visited spoke of lavish feasts, of music and laughter echoing through the night, of courtyards where power brokers mingled with courtesans. This was not the austere seat of St. Peter. It was a palace where faith and flesh intertwined, and where the man who claimed to be God's voice on earth kept his mistress as openly as any king kept his queen. It was here, in this gilded cage, that the foundations of a far darker story were laid. Her name was Vannozza de Catanei, and she was no timid, veiled figure lurking behind Vatican curtains. She was a Roman widow of considerable beauty, cunning, and ambition, a woman who understood exactly what it meant to be connected to power in Renaissance Italy. Before Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, he had been a cardinal for decades, and in that time, Venosa had already become far more than a passing lover. She was his constant, his confidant, and, in many ways, his equal in ambition. Their relationship was an open secret in Rome. Courtiers whispered, cardinals frowned, and moralists preached against the decay of the church, but none of it mattered. Rodrigo had charm, and Venosa had a kind of unshakable composure that made her immune to scandal. She attended events in fine gowns, sat at tables where only the most trusted companions of the Pope were welcome, and dined in the company of diplomats and nobles. She did not need the title of queen to command the room. She carried it in her poise. Venosa gave Rodrigo what the papacy forbade in name, but allowed in practice: a family. They had 4 children together: Cesare, the calculating and brilliant one who would trade a cardinal's robes for a commander's armor; Juan, the brash and reckless favorite; Lucrezia, whose beauty and political value would make her both a pawn and a legend; and Joffre, the youngest, destined to be the least remembered but no less tangled in the web of Borgia politics. What made the union between Rodrigo and Venosa all the more brazen was its permanence. Mistresses in papal Rome were usually replaced, their usefulness traded for novelty. But Venosa's place in Rodrigo's life, and in the Vatican's orbit, remained secure for decades. Even after she remarried twice, she and Rodrigo maintained a closeness that suggested their bond had always been something more than lust. The Vatican tolerated her existence not because they approved, but because opposing Rodrigo Borgia was political suicide. His enemies who dared whisper about the whore of the Pope often found themselves reassigned, demoted, or silenced altogether. Power, in the Renaissance, was as much about controlling the story as it was about controlling the sword, and Rodrigo excelled at both. Yet for all the political maneuvering, the relationship was not merely one of calculated advantage. In the rare glimpses the outside world caught of them together, there was a softness in Rodrigo's gaze, an ease in their private moments that no amount of scheming could counterfeit. It was in this space, between the public image of the Holy Father and the private reality of a devoted lover, that the seeds of the Borgia scandal began to grow. Because from this union came not only children, but a tangled web of desires, ambitions, and betrayals that would blur every boundary the Church was meant to uphold. And one of those boundaries, perhaps the most unthinkable of all, would eventually crumble under the weight of their family's dark legacy. Lucrezia Borgia entered the world not as a papal heir, an idea that could never be acknowledged publicly, but as a piece of living currency. In Renaissance Italy, daughters of powerful men were not measured by their wit or charm, but by the alliances they could secure through marriage. And as the daughter of Rodrigo Borgia and Venosa dei Catanei, Lucrezia was a treasure worth more than gold. From the moment she was old enough to be noticed, her future was not her own. Her beauty became a subject of fascination in the courts of Rome, Venice, and Naples. Pale skin, golden hair, and eyes that could seem warm one moment and unreadable the next. She was the ideal Renaissance bride, the kind whose face could seal a treaty, and Rodrigo knew it. Every smile she gave, every compliment she offered, was an investment in the family's power. Her first marriage, arranged when she was barely into her teens, was to Giovanni Sforza, a man from one of the most influential families in northern Italy. It was a political union, as all of her marriages would be, designed to bind the Sforzas to the Borgias in mutual interest. But behind the ceremonial blessings and feasts lay a chilling truth. Lucrezia's will had no place in the negotiations. She was an asset to be leveraged, and if the political tides changed, she could be withdrawn and redeployed elsewhere. And they did change. Within a few years, Rodrigo decided the Sforza alliance no longer served its purpose. The marriage was dissolved under the claim, publicly humiliating for Giovanni, that it had never been consummated. That accusation alone was enough to tarnish his honor, but what followed made the rumors spiral into darker territory. Whispers began to circulate in Rome's corridors. If her husband had not touched her, then who had? The most poisonous of these whispers pointed not to some secret lover or clandestine affair, but to her own family. Servants, diplomats, and rival factions traded stories that accused her father and even her brothers of a kind of intimacy that no priest could ever bless. The truth of these rumors remains buried under centuries of speculation, but in the court of public opinion, the damage was done. Rodrigo and Cesare, whether guilty or not, did nothing to quiet the talk. In fact, their fierce protectiveness over Lucrezia, keeping her close, refusing to let her slip from their influence, only fanned the flames. To their enemies, this was proof of something sordid. To their allies, it was a family closing ranks, willing to destroy reputations to keep their grip on power. For Lucrezia, it meant living in a world where her name was both a weapon and a curse. She could not escape the shadow of her father's ambition, nor the web of suspicion that seemed to tighten with each passing year. And as the Borgias climbed higher, the cost of their ascent would be written across her life. In marriages made and broken, in alliances won and lost, and in the permanent stain of whispers that refused to die. By the time Rodrigo Borgia ascended to the papacy in 1492, his appetite for control had already outgrown the quiet manipulations of a cardinal's office. Now, draped in white robes and crowned with the triple tiara, he was the vicar of Christ on earth. In theory, he was the spiritual shepherd of millions. In reality, he was a political tactician with Rome as his chessboard and every noble family a potential piece to move, capture, or sacrifice. Becoming Pope Alexander VI did not transform him into a humble servant of God. It simply gave him a stage grand enough to match his ambition. The Vatican became his personal court, and the holy offices of the Church became tools of statecraft. Cardinals were promoted not for piety but for loyalty. Diplomatic missions blurred into backroom deals. The line between a papal blessing and a bribe became invisible. His private life, far from being cloistered in celibacy, grew even more elaborate. Venosa, though aging, remained a respected figure in his household, her position secure as the mother of his children. Lucrezia and her brothers moved freely through the Vatican apartments, an arrangement that shocked foreign envoys who expected the papal residence to be a place of solemnity, not family gatherings. Rome itself reflected his reign. Streets that once echoed with the chant of monks now roared with the sounds of tournaments, feasts, and theatrical displays. Rodrigo's patronage of the arts was lavish, but it was not guided by a love for beauty alone. Each fresco, each commissioned statue was a declaration of his wealth and permanence. The city became a gallery of his power. And yet behind this pageantry, there was always calculation. Every marriage he arranged for Lucrezia was a political strike. Every appointment of Cesare was a consolidation of force. Rodrigo's papacy was not a reign of spiritual renewal, but of dynastic expansion. The Vatican was less a sanctuary than a fortress, and its ruler was less a holy father than a sovereign king. But even a fortress has weaknesses, and Rodrigo's greatest vulnerability was not the kings of France or the princes of Italy. It was the scandal that always trailed behind him. His open favor toward his children, his refusal to hide their parentage, and the growing perception that the Pope's bed was not empty, all made him an easy target. For every alliance he built, there was a rival ready to spread the next rumor, and some of those rumors were far closer to the truth than he would ever admit. The higher he rose, the more the air around him seemed charged with danger. Rodrigo had secured the throne of St. Peter, but the cost would not be measured only in gold or blood. Soon, the very fabric of his family's name would be tested. And it would not be the French army or the Venetian navy that struck first, but the tangled web of lust and loyalty within his own walls. The Vatican's marble corridors were meant to echo with prayers, yet under Rodrigo Borgia they carried softer sounds, footsteps that paused too long, laughter that belonged in private rooms, doors that closed a little too quietly. The papal court had become a hive of gossip, and the name most often spoken in half-whispers was not the Pope's, but his daughter's. Lucrezia Borgia was no ordinary young woman, blonde-haired, finely educated and fluent in several languages. She carried herself with the poise of a queen even before she was old enough to rule over anything. She was the pride of her father's eye, a living emblem of his legacy. And perhaps that was the problem. Rodrigo did not treat her as a distant child hidden away in a convent, but as a confidant, a hostess, and sometimes the jewel of his political pageantry. Foreign envoys noted her constant presence beside him during audiences and feasts, her easy laughter in his company, the way he would lean in as if sharing secrets. To some, it was merely the warmth of a father who adored his daughter. To others, especially those already suspicious of the Borgia name, it was proof that something unholy was unfolding within those frescoed walls. The rumors were sharpened by the timing of her marriages. Each union, first to Giovanni Sforza, then to Alfonso of Aragon, seemed to end abruptly as if discarded the moment it no longer served Rodrigo's plans. The annulment of her first marriage was particularly damning in the court of public opinion. Officially, the claim was that Giovanni was impotent. Unofficially, Rome's taverns and noble halls repeated a different tale, that the annulment was secured to hide the fact Lucrezia was already pregnant and that the child's father was no foreign prince. The stories spread like wildfire because they fit the image so many already had of the Borgias, a family that mixed politics and pleasure with no regard for law or morality. In those years, the Vatican was not just a center of faith, it was the most dangerous stage in Italy. Every guest at the papal court played a role, whether they knew it or not, and every word spoken could become a weapon in another man's hands. Rodrigo's enemies understood this. They fanned the rumors into scandal, painting the Pope not only as a political manipulator, but as a man whose household blurred the boundaries between family duty and forbidden desire. It didn't matter whether the whispers were entirely true. In the court of Rome, the perception was enough to poison a reputation. For Lucrezia, the gossip was a double-edged sword. It gave her a certain dangerous allure, but it also trapped her in a narrative she could not control. And for Rodrigo, the danger was greater still, because once the idea took root that the head of the Catholic Church could not keep his own house free from sin, his political enemies had the perfect line of attack. The stage was set for the Borgia family's most enduring and damning scandal, one that would follow them long after their reign in Rome ended. It began, as most Vatican scandals did, with an unmarked door in the Apostolic Palace. Behind it, somewhere away from the marble halls and frescoed chapels, a child was born into a world that had no safe place for them. There was no public announcement, no baptismal feast attended by dignitaries, only whispers, a quiet ripple among chambermaids and personal attendants, that Lucrezia Borgia had delivered a baby in secrecy. Who the father was depended entirely on who you asked. In Rome's taverns, the story was crude and direct. The child was the Pope's. In the drawing rooms of rival cardinals, the tale took on a calculated precision. The father could be either Rodrigo himself or his son, Cesare Borgia, making the child a living embodiment of incest. And among the Borgia's staunchest defenders, the rumors were dismissed as political slander concocted by jealous enemies to destroy the Pope's moral authority. The truth, however, was buried under layers of deliberate confusion. Rodrigo did nothing to dispel the whispers. In fact, he seemed to revel in the ambiguity. The child was neither acknowledged as Lucrezia's nor openly claimed by anyone else. Instead, a peculiar arrangement was made. The boy, Giovanni, was raised within the papal household, treated with affection, and granted an unusual status for someone with no declared parentage. Years later, 2 official papal documents would surface, both signed by Rodrigo, each naming a different father for Giovanni. One declared him to be Cesare's illegitimate son. The other, more provocatively, claimed the Pope himself as the father. Why issue both? Historians have debated this for centuries. Was it a clumsy attempt at covering up the truth? A calculated move to keep enemies guessing, or a display of arrogance as if Rodrigo was daring the world to challenge him? Whatever the reason, the ambiguity served a purpose. In a city where power was built on fear as much as faith, keeping one's enemies uncertain was as valuable as any army. If the truth could be both everything and nothing, then no single accusation could be pinned down. But for those who worked inside the Vatican, there was no mistaking the odd intimacy between the Pope, Lucrezia, and the child. Servants recalled seeing Rodrigo kiss the boy's forehead in the same breath he kissed Lucrezia's hand, a gesture that was warm but unsettling. There were dinners where the three sat together apart from the rest, speaking in hushed tones, the boy's small laughter mingling with his mother's, or perhaps his sister's. To Rome's common people, the idea of the Pope keeping a mistress was scandal enough. To think he might also be tied to an incestuous child was a sin so great it almost tipped into the unbelievable. And yet, the Borgias had a way of making the unthinkable seem entirely possible. The baby in the shadows would become a permanent fixture in the story of Rodrigo Borgia's papacy, a living reminder of the tangled, dangerous web that connected church politics to the most intimate reaches of his household. By the time Giovanni could walk, his existence had already outgrown the corridors of the apostolic palace. Whispers that had once been contained to kitchens and antechambers now spilled into the streets, the piazzas, and the palaces of Rome's most dangerous men. The child was no longer just a rumor. He was a political opportunity. Rodrigo's enemies, of which there were many, saw him as a gift. In the sharp hands of rival families like the Della Rovere or the Orsini, Giovanni became a dagger aimed directly at the papacy's credibility, and they knew exactly where to strike. Pamphlets began to circulate, hand-copied, anonymous, and poisonous. They didn't simply say the Pope had a mistress. They painted him as a man who blurred every line between holiness and hunger, purity and depravity. One page would mock his sacred bedchamber as if it were a brothel. Another would speculate in gleeful detail about whether Giovanni was the son of a father or a grandfather. The cruelty wasn't in the accusation, it was in the ambiguity. And Rodrigo didn't help himself. For a man who thrived on control, he had an unnerving habit of pouring fuel on his own fires. He attended court feasts with Giovanni perched on his knee. He let the boy sit beside him in public audiences. The message was unclear. Was this affection, defiance, or a calculated provocation? To his enemies, it didn't matter. Every glimpse was another drop of blood in the water. The rumors about Giovanni's parentage also found fertile ground in one of the Church's deepest fears, that Rome itself could be seduced away from God, not by outsiders, but by the very man entrusted with its salvation. And so the scandal shifted from whispers about a child to something far more dangerous, a question of divine legitimacy. If the Pope himself was tangled in incest, what moral right did he have to rule? These questions weren't just theological, they were tactical. The Della Rovere faction, led by Cardinal Giuliano Della Rovere, a man who openly despised Rodrigo, began weaving the rumors into a larger plot. If they could prove Rodrigo's corruption, they could move to unseat him. And if they couldn't prove it, they could at least bury him under the weight of suspicion. Inside the Vatican, the tension was palpable. Courtiers aligned themselves carefully, either leaning into Rodrigo's favor or quietly edging toward neutrality. No one wanted to be on the wrong side of what could become a papal war. Servants kept their eyes lowered, knowing that repeating the wrong story to the wrong ear could mean exile, imprisonment, or worse. The Borgias had always thrived in the shadows, using secrets as currency. But now the shadows themselves had teeth, and Giovanni, barely old enough to speak, had become the most dangerous secret in Rome, because everyone thought they knew it. By the spring of 1498, the whispers had swollen into something Rodrigo could no longer ignore. His enemies weren't just gossiping over wine, they were planting their stories in the ears of foreign ambassadors, feeding the scandal into the bloodstream of European politics. Letters began arriving from Spain, France, and the German states, polite on the surface, venomous underneath. Kings and princes expressed their concern over matters of the Holy Father's domestic affairs, a phrase that sounded diplomatic but was designed to humiliate. The implication was clear. The Pope's bed had become an open wound in the body of Christendom. The Della Rovere camp was already sharpening its knives. Giuliano della Rovere moved like a man rehearsing for a throne, quietly securing promises, whispering of reform, of cleansing Rome of the moral rot that had spread through its marble halls. But every reform speech he gave was really about one man, Rodrigo Borgia. The Orsini, never ones to resist the scent of blood, began their own campaign. They staged feasts and public spectacles that mocked the Pope's rumoured indulgences. At one particularly obscene masquerade, a man dressed as the pontiff appeared with a woman costumed as a Madonna, only to reveal a child clinging to her skirts. The crowd roared. No one needed to ask who the child was supposed to be. Rodrigo could not pretend ignorance. He summoned his most loyal cardinals, locking them behind the Vatican's high doors for what would be remembered as a night of red-faced shouting and bitter accusations. To Rodrigo, the matter was simple: survival. If he admitted anything, his enemies would have the noose. If he denied everything, the rumours would thrive, but at least the noose would stay just out of reach. Yet denial was becoming harder to sell. His own behaviour betrayed him. When Giovanni was brought into the papal apartments, guards noted the tenderness in Rodrigo's voice, the way he smoothed the boy's hair, the way his expression softened in a way it never did for political allies or even his other children. It was in this climate of danger and theatre that Rome began to split. On one side were the Borgias, coiled like a viper, willing to strike at anyone who dared speak Giovanni's name too loudly. On the other were the Pope's enemies, gathering in smoky chambers, trading rumours as if they were gold coins, convinced they could turn a scandal into a revolution. The stage was set. The next act would not be fought in whispers, but in open moves, letters, alliances, and perhaps even assassinations. And at the centre of it all, a boy who had no idea that his existence had become a weapon sharp enough to kill a pope. If Rodrigo was the fortress, Venosa was the breach. She was no naive girl plucked from obscurity. Venosa dei Catanei had been part of Rodrigo's life long before the tiara sat on his head. She understood him in ways others didn't. She had borne him children, shared his private moments, and learned how to read the shifts in his mood like the changes in the Roman wind. But she also carried the one thing his enemies wanted: vulnerability. By 1498, her life outside the papal chambers had become a dangerous stage. The same merchants who once bowed to her now stared too long. The same noblewomen who once invited her to dine now spoke her name like it was poison. Every errand in the city risked becoming an ambush not with blades, but with carefully crafted words. Questions disguised as gossip. Gossip disguised as confession. The Vatican's enemies had begun to court her servants. Promises of gold, of safe passage, of new lives in distant cities, all in exchange for one letter, one diary entry, one whispered truth that could be proven. Even if Venosa had been willing to speak, she knew that any word she uttered could seal her son's fate. For the Della Rovere faction, she was more than a mistress. She was the loose thread in Rodrigo's robe, the single pull that might unravel the entire garment of his authority. Rumours spread that they had dispatched agents not just to shadow her, but to seduce her loyalty away from the Borgias. A woman scorned, after all, was the perfect instrument for revenge. Rodrigo knew this, and his paranoia tightened. Venosa's movements were restricted. Trusted guards replaced her household staff. Visitors were screened. Letters were burned before they could be read twice. And still, he could not bring himself to sever ties entirely. To push her away would be to admit fear. And Rodrigo Borgia never admitted fear. Meanwhile, Giovanni grew in the shadows of this tension, old enough to hear the venom in whispered arguments, too young to understand why his mother's eyes were always wet when she looked at him. To the boy, the Vatican was not a holy place. It was a gilded cage with bars made of secrets, and secrets in Rome never stayed caged for long. Because somewhere beyond the city walls, an idea was growing, not to simply humiliate the Pope, but to strip him bare in front of the entire Christian world. The mistress would be bait, the child would be proof, and the church itself would be the stage for a public shaming no pontiff had ever survived. The clock was ticking, and Rodrigo's enemies were patient hunters. They knew that all prey, no matter how cunning, eventually makes a fatal move. The Vatican was a palace, but it was also a stage. Its marble corridors echoed with Latin prayers and whispered insults. Behind every frescoed wall, there was a listener. Behind every gilded door, a spy. Rodrigo Borgia, for all his power, could not silence the city of Rome, and in Rome, silence was the rarest commodity of all. By the turn of the year, his enemies had stopped waiting for mistakes. They would make them happen. The scheme was deceptively simple. Push the Pope into a corner where his personal life and his papal duties collided in public view. One scandal was not enough. Rodrigo could bury a rumor beneath golden threats. But a spectacle, undeniable, witnessed by many, impossible to explain away, that could topple even the most defiant man in Christendom. The plan began with the child. Giovanni was young but old enough to be recognized. His face was the living evidence of Rodrigo's private sins. The Borgia eyes, the sharp jawline, the way his features mirrored both the Pope and the woman who had raised him. If the boy could be placed in the right company at the wrong time, the implication would not need to be spoken. The court of public opinion would do the rest. Vanosa was the second lever. Rome's streets loved a tragic figure, and a fallen mistress was the perfect one. A letter written in her hand, even if forged, would be enough to suggest bitterness, betrayal, or confession. If her reputation could be tangled with stories of jealousy toward her own children, or worse, of competition for Rodrigo's attention, it would give the enemy's narrative a taste of the grotesque. And so subtle moves began. A trusted servant in Vanosa's house suddenly came into money. A stable hand whispered that he had seen her with a letter marked by an unfamiliar seal. The palace guards swore they spotted her walking in the company of men known to serve the Della Rovere family. None of it was provable, all of it was believable. Rodrigo, as always, tried to hold the line. Publicly, he doubled down on the image of a strong, unshakable pontiff. Privately, he grew more isolated, audiences were shorter, meetings ended abruptly, and when he did speak to his closest advisors, his questions had shifted, no longer about trade agreements or theological disputes. Now they were about loyalty, about who could be trusted to watch the doors, about which cardinals had been seen in whose company after sunset. The net was drawing tighter, though he could not yet see the fisherman. Every move his enemies made was meant to feel like coincidence, like the hand of God pushing fate towards scandal. But this was no act of heaven, it was the work of men who understood that in Rome destruction was not a swift blow from a sword, it was a slow tightening of the rope until the victim offered his own neck. And Rodrigo, for all his cunning, was starting to feel the rope. It began, as most Roman scandals did, with an invitation. A cardinal of unimpeachable status, or so he seemed, sent word to the Vatican of a private banquet in honor of a visiting dignitary from Naples. The guest list was short, exclusive, and deliberately chosen. It was the sort of event that, by custom, a pope could attend without raising eyebrows. Rodrigo accepted. The hall was all light and spectacle. Torches blazed against polished stone. Wine flowed in golden cups before the first course was served. At the head of the table sat the host, smiling as if he had gathered the finest minds in Christendom to celebrate diplomacy. But beneath the music and chatter, a quiet choreography was at work. Every seat had been assigned for a reason. Every arrival had been timed to perfection. Rodrigo took his place, flanked by two cardinals whose loyalty was, at best, uncertain. Across the table sat Vanosa. She had not been told Rodrigo would be present. Her lips tightened, her gaze darting to the side as she took in the sight of him in his white robes. To her right, and this was no accident, sat Giovanni. The boy, dressed finely for the occasion, smiled with the easy charm of youth, unaware that he was the centerpiece in a play he had not agreed to perform. The first hour passed in harmless conversation, a display of civility meant to lower Rodrigo's guard. But then, between the courses, a subtle shift began. The musicians quieted, servants moved slower. The air itself seemed to lean in. A cardinal down the table raised a glass, his voice carrying just enough to reach every ear. "A toast," he said, "to the bonds of family. Those sacred ties that bind us in loyalty, in love, and sometimes in ways the Lord himself might not have intended." The words hung in the air, too deliberate to be dismissed as drunken rambling. All eyes moved between Rodrigo, Vanozza, and the boy. Giovanni, sensing the sudden heaviness in the room, looked from face to face in confusion. Vanozza's hand tightened on the boy's shoulder. Rodrigo's jaw set, but he did not speak. And then came the final stroke. A servant approached the head of the table, carrying a small velvet pouch. He bowed, whispered something into the host's ear, and placed the pouch before Giovanni. Inside, wrapped in silk, was a gold medallion, engraved with the Borgia crest and the words "In Perpetuum." The silence was absolute. No one needed to explain what the medallion meant, or why a boy officially recognized as the Pope's nephew would carry the same family crest reserved for blood. The message was complete. Somewhere in the shadows, one of the Pope's enemies was already smiling. By dawn, the story had already mutated. Rome did not sleep when gossip was this sweet. By the time the sun rose over the Tiber, the banquet had been retold in market stalls, in bakeries, in the smoky backrooms of taverns where the city's heartbeat pulsed loudest. Some swore the medallion had been given in a grand, public ceremony. Others insisted Rodrigo had publicly embraced the boy, calling him "my son" in front of the cardinals. Truth no longer mattered. The important thing was that the suggestion, the possibility, had been planted. In the narrow streets outside the Vatican, merchants lingered in doorways pretending to arrange their goods while trading the latest details. The fishmongers laughed into their sleeves. The silk sellers, with customers leaning over bolts of fabric, whispered as if they were passing on state secrets. Every retelling made the scene grander, the scandal darker. Inside the Vatican, the atmosphere was taut, brittle. Rodrigo's private chambers had become a fortress of controlled panic. His most loyal advisors were summoned one by one, each sworn to secrecy, though the secrecy was already shattered. Orders were given to identify the banquet's instigators. Money changed hands in hurried exchanges meant to buy silence. Threats were issued in soft voices, the kind that carried more weight than shouting ever could. But the damage was not contained within the walls. Rome's clergy, those who owed their careers to Rodrigo and those who despised him equally, carried the whispers through cathedrals and cloisters. Some saw an opportunity to weaken him, others simply enjoyed the spectacle. The more sanctimonious cardinals framed it as a warning from God. The less sanctimonious framed it as a warning to keep their own indiscretions quiet. Meanwhile, Vanozza kept to her home, blinds drawn, servants turned away from the windows. She had lived long enough to know that scandals were not extinguished by truth, but by exhaustion, and this one had enough oxygen to burn for months. Giovanni, still too young to understand the depth of it, asked her why people were angry. She did not answer him. In the catacombs beneath one of Rome's ancient churches, where certain meetings were held away from curious ears, a small group of Rodrigo's most determined enemies gathered. They spoke not just of his hypocrisy, but of how to use this rumor as a wedge, a way to pry his allies from his side, to make the papacy itself seem tainted. One man, a cardinal with a soft voice and sharper ambitions, said quietly, "This is how you bring down a pope, not with armies, but with shame." Above their heads, the bells of St. Peter's tolled for morning prayers. The sound was steady, pure. And to Rodrigo Borgia, in that moment, it might as well have been a death knell. Scandal, like trade, was one of Rome's most reliable exports. By the end of the week, the rumors that began as candlelit whispers in the Vatican's corridors had hitched a ride with merchants, diplomats, and pilgrims. They traveled down the Appian Way, crossed the Alps, and slipped into the courts of Europe with the speed and precision of an invading army. In Florence, where the ruling elite were no strangers to moral compromise, the news was met with wry amusement. Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici was said to have laughed openly when told of the Pope's alleged indulgences, remarking, "Rome never fails to remind us why sin is so fashionable." In the palaces of Venice, masked gossip spread through ornate halls, shared between noblemen who pretended to be shocked while calculating what this might mean for their trade negotiations with the Papal States. In Spain, the reaction was sharper. Spain had given Rodrigo Borgia to the papacy. He was theirs by birth, if not entirely by virtue. The Spanish crown could not afford to ignore the accusations, yet could not publicly admit them either. Courtiers were instructed to dismiss the rumors as jealousy from corrupt Italian rivals. But the private conversations told a different story. Ambassadors sent home reports noting the Pope's increasing vulnerability, as if they were describing a fortress with its gates left ajar. France received the scandal like a gift. King Charles VIII, who had already eyed Italy with ambition, saw in these whispers the perfect weapon. A pope tarnished by sin was a pope who could be pressured, manipulated, and perhaps replaced. In letters sealed with wax and written in the guarded language of diplomacy, French envoys spoke of Rome as weakened by its own appetites. Even the Holy Roman Empire, that sprawling, restless patchwork of territories, found use for the tale. Clergymen there took to their pulpits, not to defend the Pope, but to remind their flocks that the seat of St. Peter was occupied by mortal men, and mortal men fall. The implication was clear enough. For Rodrigo, the danger was no longer confined to Rome's streets or the whispers of rival cardinals. The scandal had breached borders, infecting the perception of his papacy far beyond his reach. Once foreign kings began to measure him in terms of leverage rather than reverence, the balance of power shifted. Every treaty, every alliance, every whispered negotiation would now carry the unspoken weight of his public shame. He had not yet lost control, but the ground beneath him was no longer steady. Rodrigo Borgia had spent his life in a world where weakness meant death, and death often came dressed as friendship. He understood instinctively that scandal was a kind of weapon, sharp enough to kill if wielded carelessly, but also capable of cutting the right throat when guided by a steady hand. If his enemies wanted to paint him as a man of appetites, then he would be the hungriest man in the room. If they whispered that he was ruled by desire, then he would make desire the source of his authority. He would not hide from the image they had built. He would refine it, own it, and make it serve him. Publicly, he leaned into the grandeur of the papal court, expanding its banquets, parades, and entertainments until they rivaled the feasts of ancient emperors. Diplomats invited to these spectacles returned home dazzled, their reports filled with descriptions of endless tables, flowing wine, and the Pope presiding with the relaxed confidence of a man untouched by accusation. It was as if the rumors had never reached him, or worse, as if he found them amusing. Privately, he used the scandal as a filter, a way to separate those who could be trusted from those who could not. Men who recoiled or hesitated were kept at arm's length. Those who laughed, who brushed off the accusations as political theatre, were drawn closer. The scandal became a litmus test, and Rodrigo read the results with precision. He even turned it into a bargaining chip. When foreign envoys hinted, delicately, that the Pope's reputation was a subject of concern back home, Rodrigo offered them favours, concessions, or discreet papal blessings in exchange for their silence. The gossip became a currency, traded in private chambers, sealed with both handshake and threat. This was the paradox of his rule. The same whispers meant to weaken him became part of his mystique. They gave him the aura of a man too dangerous to topple, too entangled in the affairs of kings to be replaced without consequence. And Rodrigo understood better than most that in politics, Perception was not just power, it was survival. But the strategy had limits. Sin, once embraced, could not be controlled forever. Every feast, every calculated display, every whispered bargain bought him time, but also fed the hunger of those who wanted to see him fall. The mask of control could hold only so long before the cracks showed. And in the Vatican, where loyalty was often rented by the hour, cracks had a way of widening into ruin. For years, Rodrigo Borgia had walked the edge of a blade, balancing sin and sanctity so perfectly that the two became indistinguishable. But every act of control plants the seed of its own undoing, and in the Vatican, the soil was fertile. The first cracks were small, almost invisible to those outside his closest circle. An ally who stopped returning letters. A cardinal who, once loud in his praise, now spoke in polite, hollow phrases. At banquets, laughter still filled the air, but Rodrigo noticed who was laughing less and who was whispering more. Some fractures came from within his own family. The alliances he had brokered through his children began to strain. Lucrezia's political marriages, tools in her father's game, created resentments in powerful houses. Cesare's ambition, once a weapon Rodrigo wielded, began to cut in unpredictable directions. The more Rodrigo tried to direct his son's rise, the more Cesare began to act as though the papacy was merely a stepping stone to his own empire. Outside the palace walls, the tone of the gossip shifted. The rumors no longer had the light, scandalous flavor of courtly intrigue. They grew heavier, sharper. Stories of the Pope's indulgences began to mingle with accusations of corruption in church finances, of political murders disguised as divine justice. The Mistress was no longer just a salacious footnote. She was painted as a schemer who influenced papal decisions for her own gain, and the child, their child, became the center of whispered theories, too tangled to untangle, but damaging all the same. Rodrigo tried to smother the fires before they spread. Gold still bought silence, but it bought less of it. A few key enemies, long restrained by the promise of reward or the threat of ruin, began to sense opportunity. They spoke in shadows at first, then in councils, then dangerously in open court. The shift was subtle but undeniable. For the first time in years, Rodrigo was no longer the man shaping the game. He was reacting to it. Every calculated move now felt like a response, not an initiation. And for a ruler who had built his reign on control, this was the beginning of the end. The mask had not yet fallen, but the fractures in the throne were widening. In Rome, no seat, not even the papal one, could withstand the weight of too many cracks. By the time the scandal reached the far edges of the papal states, it was no longer just a rumor. Courtiers spoke in lowered voices, but they spoke often, and they spoke everywhere. Messengers who once carried decrees about taxes and treaties now carried news of the Pope's household arrangements. Inside the Vatican's marble halls there was a different kind of silence, not the reverent hush of prayer, but the taut quiet of calculation. Men who had once been loyal now weighed their loyalty against their own survival. Every scandal in Rome was a storm, and storms always needed someone to drown. The Mistress stayed behind high walls, her face unseen for weeks. The child, the one who carried both holy and forbidden blood, had vanished from public view entirely. Some said the Pope had sent them away to a country villa, others whispered of darker outcomes. Either way, the absence was as loud as the gossip. Yet still, the Pope appeared at Mass in gleaming robes, his hands raised in blessing as if nothing at all had shifted beneath him. It was a performance, and he knew it. Every step down the nave, every glance toward the altar was less about piety now, and more about defiance. The church could close its eyes, but the city could not forget. Rome had learned how to live with corruption. It had learned to survive on rumors and half-truths, on the strange balance between reverence and resentment. But this was different. This was not some distant sin tucked away in backroom deals. This was flesh and blood, played out under the shadow of St. Peter's dome. The people saw it as an insult, a defilement not just of faith, but of the city's own dignity. Vendors in the markets began to slip barbed jokes into their haggling. Priests in private started speaking the Pope's name with something closer to pity than reverence. Even the nobles, whose fortunes had always relied on staying in favor, began to lean ever so slightly toward open criticism. When the people of Rome turn, they do so slowly, but when the tide comes, it does not retreat. And here, the tide was already at the Pope's gates. Inside, the man in white still moved through candlelit corridors, still signed decrees, still played the part of God's chosen. But every knock at the door, every unexpected visitor, carried the weight of uncertainty. Was it a message of loyalty, or the first move toward his undoing? In the end, it was not a grand uprising or a dramatic assassination that ended his reign. It was quieter than that, a cough that lingered, a pallor that deepened. Whispers in the Vatican corridors about illness, about divine judgment, about the inevitable. The mistress stayed near, her presence now less scandalous than strangely pathetic. The figure who had once been called temptress now sitting silently at his bedside. The child, grown enough to understand pieces of the truth but not its full weight, remained in the shadows. Rome had stopped speaking of them openly. The scandal had curdled into something colder, a collective decision to forget. When the bells finally tolled, the city exhaled, not in grief, not in celebration, but in weary relief. His name would remain in the ledgers carved into marble, but in whispers it would always be followed by the story of the mistress and the child, of a pope who confused the sacred with the profane. And so the man who had once held the keys to heaven left this world, carrying with him a legacy not of holiness, but of shadows. History has a way of disguising its ugliest truths behind marble walls and sacred titles. You pull back the curtains, and it is never just faith or ceremony. It is hunger, desire, and power in their rawest forms. We leave the Vatican tonight, but the shadows cling, they always do, and if you think the marriage of religion and the flesh reached its darkest point here, you are mistaken. In our next chapter, we leave Rome behind and step into the blood-soaked temples of the Aztec Empire. A night when priests claimed to honor their gods by sacrificing 1,000 virgins, each death a ritual, each act more horrific and intimate than the last. That story is not for the faint of heart, but then again, neither was this one.